Margaret Ellis stepped down from the stagecoach into a world of blue sky and endless mountains, clutching the handle of a worn leather trunk that held everything she owned in the world, which was, at that point in her life, distressingly little. Beside her stood her 3 children, Thomas, 11 and solemn beyond his years, Eliza, 14 and guarded in the particular way that children become when they've watched too many adults fail them, and little Grace, only 6, who still held onto the innocent belief that the world was kind because she had not yet lived long enough to learn otherwise. Margaret had buried her husband 8 months earlier, a good man named William who had died of a lung sickness that took him slowly over a hard winter, leaving her with debts she could not pay and a landlord in St. Louis who made it clear, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that a widow with 3 children and no income was not a tenant he intended to keep. She had answered an advertisement in a newspaper, one of many placed by ranchers and homesteaders across the Western Territories seeking wives, and had corresponded for 2 months with a man named Caleb Hartwell, a rancher in the mountain valleys of Wyoming who had lost his own wife 3 years earlier to a fever and was raising 3 children of his own, needing, as his letters had put it plainly, a mother for his children and a partner for the hard work of the ranch, though he had never once, in all their correspondence, pretended the arrangement would be anything other than practical. Margaret had not expected love from this arrangement. She had expected, at best, stability, a roof over her children's heads and food on their table, and had steeled herself for the possibility that Caleb Hartwell might be a hard man, or a cold one, or worse, given how little control a woman in her position truly had over the character of the stranger she was bound to marry. So when the stagecoach rounded the final bend and she saw him standing there, waiting beside the split-rail fence of a homestead nestled beneath snow-capped peaks, flanked by his own 3 children, she found herself holding her breath, searching his face for some sign of what kind of man he might be. He was tall, weathered by sun and work, with a beard that hadn't seen a razor in a few days and eyes that, when they met hers, held none of the coldness she had feared but instead a kind of careful, searching warmth, as though he too was uncertain what to expect but had decided, regardless, to meet the moment with kindness. His children stood beside him in a loose row, a boy of about 12 with a guarded, watchful expression, a younger boy of perhaps 9 who fidgeted with barely contained curiosity, and a girl of about 7 who, without any prompting from her father, stepped forward and extended her small hand toward Margaret with an openness that nearly broke the careful composure Margaret had been holding on to since William's death. Caleb introduced himself and his children, his voice steady but not unkind, and Margaret did the same, watching as her own children studied their new siblings with the same cautious uncertainty being returned to them. It was an awkward moment, 6 children and 2 adults suddenly bound together by necessity and a stack of letters, none of them quite sure how to bridge the distance between strangers and family, but Caleb, sensing the tension, knelt down to Grace's level and asked her, with genuine interest, whether she liked horses, and when Grace nodded shyly, he told her that he had a mare in the barn who had just had a foal a few weeks back, and that she was welcome to come see it whenever she liked. It was a small kindness, but Margaret felt something in her chest loosen at the sight of it, a flicker of hope that perhaps this arrangement, born of desperation and practicality, might yet become something gentler than she had dared to imagine. The wedding took place 2 days later, a brief and unceremonious affair conducted by the circuit preacher who passed through the valley once a month, witnessed only by Caleb's nearest neighbors, the Whitmores, who lived a few miles down the valley and had been friends of Caleb's late wife. There was no pretense of romance in the ceremony itself, only a quiet exchange of vows between 2 people who understood the practical weight of what they were undertaking. But afterward, as the small gathering shared a simple supper at the long wooden table in Caleb's cabin, Margaret watched her children slowly, tentatively, begin to interact with their new siblings, Thomas cautiously asking Caleb's eldest son, Daniel, about the ranch and its workings, Eliza exchanging quiet, assessing glances with Caleb's daughter Ruth that suggested the beginnings of an understanding forged from shared wariness rather than immediate friendship, and Grace already, within hours, treating Caleb's youngest son, Samuel, as though they had known each other their whole lives, the 2 of them giggling over some private joke at the far end of the table. The early weeks of the marriage were, as Margaret had expected, defined largely by hard work rather than sentiment. She rose before dawn to help with the milking and the cooking, learned the particular rhythms of ranch life that were so different from the city existence she'd known before, and found herself falling into bed each night too exhausted to do much more than sleep. Her body aching in ways it never had before, but her mind, strangely, quieter than it had been in months, occupied by the immediate demands of the present, rather than haunted by grief and worry over the future. Caleb, for his part, proved to be exactly the kind of man his letters had suggested. Steady, fair, hard-working, and possessed of a quiet decency that showed itself not in grand gestures but in small, consistent acts. The way he made sure Margaret's children were included in ranch chores in ways that gave them purpose rather than making them feel like burdens. The way he never once raised his voice even when Thomas, still grieving his father and uncertain of his place in this new family, tested boundaries with a sullen defiance that might have provoked a harsher man to anger. It was Thomas, in fact, who presented the greatest challenge to the fragile peace of their blended household. He had been closest to William, had spent his boyhood following his father through the streets of St. Louis learning his trade as a carpenter, and the loss had hit him hardest of all the children, manifesting not in tears but in a simmering anger that he directed, at times, toward Caleb, as though accepting kindness from this new father figure might somehow constitute a betrayal of the one he'd lost. He was sullen at meals, resistant to instruction, and prone to disappearing for hours at a time when chores felt like more than he could bear, and Margaret watched with growing anxiety as the tension between her son and her new husband threatened to poison the fragile trust the rest of the family had been building. She expected, given what she'd heard of other men in similar situations, that Caleb might eventually lose patience, might resort to harsh discipline or cold distance to manage a stepson who so clearly resented his presence. Instead, one evening when Thomas had failed to return from one of his solitary disappearances well past supper, Caleb saddled his horse without a word of complaint and rode out into the darkening evening to find him. Returning nearly 2 hours later with Thomas seated silently behind him on the horse, both of them soaked through from an unexpected rain shower. Margaret, frantic with worry by the time they returned, rushed out to meet them, but Caleb simply helped Thomas down, told him to get dry clothes and warm himself by the fire, and said nothing more about the incident that night. It was only the following morning that Margaret learned what had happened during those 2 hours, when Thomas, uncharacteristically talkative over breakfast, mentioned that Caleb had found him sitting by the creek where he'd gone to be alone, and rather than scolding him or dragging him home immediately, had simply sat down beside him and asked him to talk about his father, about what he missed most, about what scared him most regarding this new life he'd been thrust into without any say in the matter. Thomas had, apparently, talked for the better part of an hour, unburdening grief he'd been carrying silently for months, and Caleb had listened without judgment, offering not platitudes but genuine understanding, having lost his own wife and knowing intimately the particular loneliness of grief that children carry differently than adults. By the time they'd ridden home, something had shifted in Thomas, some of the anger that had been calcifying around his grief finally beginning to soften into something more manageable, and in the weeks that followed, Margaret watched her son slowly, cautiously, begin to warm toward the man who had married his mother not with grand declarations but with the same patient consistency he brought to everything else in his life. As autumn deepened into winter, the household that had begun as an arrangement of convenience slowly transformed into something that bore a genuine resemblance to family. The 6 children, thrown together by circumstance, found their own rhythms of sibling rivalry and affection, Eliza and Ruth becoming close confidants despite their initial wariness, bonding over shared responsibilities and a mutual, unspoken understanding of what it meant to have lost a parent and gained a step-parent in the span of a single year. Grace and Samuel remained nearly inseparable, their easy friendship a source of quiet joy for both households. Even Daniel and Thomas, who had initially circled each other with the wary competitiveness of boys uncertain of their place in a new hierarchy, found common ground in shared ranch work, Daniel patiently teaching Thomas the skills of ranching that had once seemed so foreign to a boy raised in a city, and Thomas, in turn, showing a natural aptitude for building and repair that impressed even Caleb, who began, with quiet pride, to describe Thomas's carpentry skills as a genuine asset to the ranch's upkeep. Between Margaret and Caleb, something was growing too, slower and more tentative than the children's friendships but no less real, built not from romantic declarations but from the accumulated weight of shared labor, shared meals, shared late-night conversations by the fire after the children had gone to bed, when the two of them would sit together discussing the practical concerns of the ranch and household, but gradually, over weeks and months, beginning to share more personal reflections as well about their late spouses, about their fears for their children's futures, about the strange, unexpected grace of finding themselves less alone than either had anticipated when they'd first entered into this arrangement born of necessity. Margaret found herself, to her own surprise, beginning to look forward to these evening conversations with an eagerness that went beyond mere companionship, and she noticed, too, the way Caleb's eyes would soften when he looked at her across the table, the way his hand would occasionally brush hers when passing a dish, small moments that carried a weight neither of them had anticipated when they'd first exchanged those careful, practical letters. The first real test of their bond as a blended family came with a harsh winter that settled over the valley in January. A season so brutal that it claimed livestock across the region and left several neighboring families struggling to keep their homes heated and their children fed. A blizzard struck without warning one afternoon while Caleb and Daniel were out checking on the cattle in the higher pastures, and as the storm intensified with alarming speed, Margaret watched the window with mounting terror as visibility dropped to almost nothing, the temperature plummeting to levels that could prove fatal to anyone caught outdoors without shelter. She wanted desperately to ride out after them herself, but the younger children needed her, and it was Thomas, newly confident in his growing ranch skills, who insisted on taking a horse to search for his stepfather and stepbrother, a suggestion Margaret initially refused out of fear for her own son's safety until she saw the steady determination in his eyes, the same quiet resolve she had once seen in his father, and understood that this was Thomas's way of proving, to himself as much as anyone, that he had truly become part of this family, willing to risk himself for a man he had once resented. She relented, bundling Thomas as warmly as possible and sending him out with clear instructions and a lantern to guide his way, and the hours that followed were among the longest of Margaret's life, spent huddled with the younger children by the fire, praying with a fervency she hadn't felt since William's illness that she would not lose another member of her family to circumstances beyond her control. It was nearly midnight when the door finally burst open, admitting a blast of frigid air along with three exhausted snow-covered figures, Caleb, Daniel, and Thomas, all three having found each other part way through the storm after Caleb and Daniel had taken shelter in an old line shack when the blizzard's severity became clear, and Thomas, guided partly by luck and partly by an instinct for the land he'd developed faster than anyone expected, having found them there. Margaret wept openly at the sight of them, pulling all three into an embrace that erased any remaining distance between stepfather, stepson, and the family they had all, without quite realizing it, become. It was that night, after the children had finally been settled and the adrenaline of the crisis had begun to fade, that Caleb found Margaret still awake by the dying fire, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, and sat down beside her, taking her hand in his with a tenderness that had been building between them for months but had never before been so openly expressed. He told her that watching Thomas ride out into that storm to search for him, watching the boy who had once resented his very presence risk his own safety for his sake, had made him realize something he hadn't fully allowed himself to acknowledge until that moment, that somewhere in the months since Margaret and her children had arrived, they had stopped being merely a practical arrangement and had become, fully and completely, his family, in every sense that mattered. He told her that he had married her expecting a partnership, but had found, instead, something he had believed lost to him forever after his first wife's death. A genuine, deep love, built not on the whirlwind passion of youth, but on the steady accumulation of shared hardship and shared joy, the kind of love that Margaret realized, as she listened to him speak, she had been quietly falling into as well without fully admitting it to herself. She told him, her voice thick with emotion, that she had come to this valley expecting nothing more than survival for herself and her children, had braced herself for a marriage of cold practicality, and had found instead a man whose quiet kindness had reshaped not only her own heart but the hearts of all 6 children under their roof, weaving 2 grieving, fractured families into something whole and strong. Caleb smiled then, the same warm smile she had first seen when she stepped off the stagecoach all those months ago, and told her that from the moment he'd watched her children step down from that coach, wary but dignified despite everything they'd lost, he had known, somehow, that she was exactly the mother his children had needed, and that he had simply been waiting, patiently, for the day she might come to believe the same was true of him. By the time spring returned to the valley, melting the snow from the mountain peaks and coaxing new grass from the thawing earth, The Hartwell household had become something neither Margaret nor Caleb could have predicted when they'd first exchanged those careful, practical letters months before. 6 children who had begun as strangers bound together by circumstance now moved through their days with the easy familiarity of true siblings, squabbling and laughing and looking out for one another with a devotion that had grown organically from shared hardship and mutual care. And Margaret and Caleb, who had entered their marriage seeking nothing more than practical partnership, found themselves instead deeply, unmistakably in love, their bond forged not in the fire of youthful passion but in the steadier, more enduring warmth of 2 people who had chosen day after day through hardship and joy alike to build something lasting together. On the porch of the cabin where it had all begun, watching their children play in the spring sunshine against the backdrop of mountains that had once seemed so foreign to Margaret and now felt simply, completely like home, Caleb wrapped his arm around her shoulders and told her that he thanked God every single day for the storm-tossed stagecoach that had brought her into his life, and Margaret, leaning into him with a contentment she had once believed impossible to reclaim after loss, knew, without a shadow of doubt, that whatever else life might bring, she had finally truly found her way home.